Hien Street was quieter than usual today. Only a few street vendors were hunched over, preparing for the morning, their breaths forming thin clouds in the chilly air. The rattling sound of a rice seller's cart echoed softly in the narrow alley, blending with the faint howling of the wind through the faded signboards. In the distance, a few motorbikes zipped by, leaving faint trails of light in the hazy mist. Amidst that silence, a small figure moved slowly, weaving through the narrow alleys of the old quarter. It was a small, cream-colored dog, skinny but quick. Its head was lowered, damp nose pressed to the ground, sniffing every corner as if searching for something important. The locals were all familiar with it, affectionately calling it Kem, a smart and lively stray, but belonging to no one. Kem survived on the kindness of street vendors and the generosity of the owners of the owners of the owners. It knew exactly which shop might spare a bone or when the bread sellers would toss it a crumb. But this morning, Kem did not follow its usual routine. It felt that something was off. The biting wind cut through its fur, but Kem pressed on. Its ears pricked up, alert, as it moved through dark alleys where moss-covered walls crumbled with broken bricks. Suddenly, a faint sound made Kem stop immediately. It was something very small. It tilted its head, listening. A weak sob, nearly swept away by the wind. Kem's nose sniffed more intensely, deep brown eyes scanning every shadow. It followed the sound cautiously, step by step, until it reached the end of a small alley where a large trash bin lay silently. The sobbing came from there. Approaching cautiously, Kem sniffed the air, the smell of damp fabric, rotting paper, stale food, and something else. Warm, fragile, but unmistakably alive. Instinct told it that something very important was here. Gently, it used its snout to nudge aside the pile of old rags next to the trash bin. The torn fabric fell to the ground, revealing a tiny figure curled up beneath an infant. Kem froze. The baby was wrapped in a thin blanket, its tiny body shivering in the bitter cold. Pale lips, tiny hands poking out, clenched tight. The infant let out weak cries, as if it had been crying all night but no one had heard. Kem took a step back, breathing quickly. It had never seen anything like this before. But in that moment, its instincts flared fiercely. This was not something to abandon. This was a life in desperate need of help. Kem gently licked the infant's tiny hand, its warm tongue brushing against the cold skin. The baby stirred slightly, eyelids fluttering as if trying to open. Kem looked around. The alley was still empty, not a soul in sight. The fog continued to linger, shrouding the street. Kem lowered his head, carefully biting the corner of the blanket, and gently pulled the baby out of the pile of trash. It used the slightest force, afraid of hurting the fragile little body. But where should it take the baby now? The instincts that had guided Kem through countless wanderings stirred once more. It had seen many places, knew where there were people and where there was help. And there was one place in particular where it had seen humans carrying frail creatures, where gentle hands were always present, Bakme Hospital. Kem decided to take the baby there. It pulled the blanket tighter around the baby and began its arduous journey through fog-shrouded streets in the biting cold of a winter morning. Every step was firm, as if Kem understood that the baby's fate depended entirely on it. The fog remained thick, curling around old rooftops and creeping into every narrow alley. Bitter wind swept through the empty streets, carrying a chill that pierced to the bone. Kem carefully adjusted the blanket around the baby, quickening its pace but remaining gentle enough not to harm the tiny life it was desperately trying to protect. The brick-paved streets were slippery under its paws, but Kem did not hesitate. It knew the way back, my hospital, the place where it had seen those in white coats welcoming the weakest with open arms. However, the hospital was quite far, and Kem had never crossed such crowded streets with a mission this important. The streets were starting to come to life. Street vendors were setting up on the sidewalks, the aroma of hot pho mingling with the smoldering scent of charcoal. A few bread sellers stood hunched in thick coats, rubbing their hands together for warmth. No one paid attention to Kem, just a stray dog wandering the streets, dragging along an old blanket. They were too accustomed to such a sight, too occupied with their own lives and worries. Kem couldn't cry for help. It could only keep moving, weaving between hurried legs and dodging the dangerous wheels of passing motorbikes. But at that very moment, the baby started to cry. Not the weak whimper from before, but a loud, choking wail. The sound was tiny amidst the city's clamor, but just loud enough to make someone turn around. A middle-aged man in an old padded jacket pushing a cart stopped abruptly. He frowned, bending down to look at the small stray dog tugging a strange blanket. "What's that?" he muttered. Kem paused, lifting its head, deep brown eyes gleaming in the mist. It knew the man was watching. He took a step closer, intending to take a better look. But just then, a motorbike sped past, narrowly missing him. "Beep, beep!" The horn blared sharply. The man recoiled instinctively, angrily waving at the bike to slow down. But when he turned back, the cream-colored dog was already gone. Kem ran, unable to stop, unable to let anything stand in its way. It had to get to the hospital. Morning light slowly brightened as Kem crossed Hien Street, where bare trees stretched their gnarled branches against the gray sky. Just a little further, it could see the hospital gate faintly in the distance. But the moment Kim set paw on the sidewalk in front of the hospital, a loud shout rang out. "Get lost, stray dog!" A security guard in a dark green uniform stepped forward, gripping a baton. He didn't look closely, only saw a filthy dog dragging something that looked like a rag. Startled, Kim backed away a step, but did not give up. It barked, loud and desperate, as if trying to scream at the humans that someone needed help to look. But its barks were drowned out by the cacophony of the hospital morning. Ambulance sirens, chattering voices, loudspeakers announcing clinic schedules. No one paid attention to a stray dog. The guard scowled, stepping forward and swinging his baton. "Go away!" Kim dodged just in time, barking even louder, its front paws pressing against the ground, eyes filled with determination. Finally, someone heard. A young woman stepped out of the hospital gate. Her long black hair was neatly tied back, her eyes weary but sharp. She wore a white coat, holding a steaming cup of coffee. She had just finished her night shift, and she recognized the dog. "Kem?" she gasped. Kem turned to look at her, deep brown eyes full of hope. This woman knew it. More than once she had seen it lingering near the hospital gate after her shifts, sometimes crouching down to offer it a piece of bread from her hurried breakfast. But today, Kem didn't wag its tail as usual. It pulled the blanket urgently, eyes pleading for help. The security guard opened his mouth to shout again, but the young woman raised a hand to stop him. She descended the steps slowly, approaching the small dog. Kneeling down, her eyes accidentally caught sight of a tiny hand peeking out from the blanket. Her cup of coffee slipped from her hand, spilling onto the ground. "Oh my God," she gasped, quickly pulling back the blanket. Beneath the crumpled fabric was a baby, its tiny face pale with cold, cracked lips slightly parted, eyes weak but still glimmering with a faint hope. The woman felt her heart clench. An infant? And this dog had brought it here, crossing countless streets in the biting cold of winter. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze in time. She couldn't believe her eyes. But then the instinct of a doctor surged within her. She scooped the baby into her arms, sprang to her feet, and screamed towards the hospital entrance. "Emergency, now!" Her shout pierced the bustling hospital grounds, shattering the morning's chaos. A few doctors and nurses nearby turned, eyes widening in shock at the sight of a small dog standing beside an infant. The old blanket still hung loosely from its mouth. The young woman held the baby tightly in her arms, feeling its faint breaths against her neck. Her heart pounded wildly. "Bring an emergency stretcher here, quickly," she shouted. A young nurse, panicked, rushed inside while a few others ran over. No one understood what had just happened. All they saw was a stray dog that had dragged a baby to the hospital. Kim stood there, eyes fixed on the baby, ears drooping as if it was worried about something. As soon as the stretcher arrived, the woman carefully placed the baby on it, swiftly checking its condition. Bluish lips, ice-cold hands, weak breaths. This was no ordinary case. Without immediate care, the baby might not survive. "Take it to the emergency room now," she commanded. The stretcher sped through the hospital doors. Bystanders stared in shock, whispering among themselves. Some looked towards the baby, while others glanced at the small dog, shivering but determinedly following behind. The security guard frowned, stepping forward to block it. Dogs aren't allowed inside, but the woman stopped him immediately. "Wait!" She knelt down, looking into Kem's amber eyes. This was no ordinary stray. It had saved a life and wasn't willing to leave. Taking a deep breath, she turned to the guard. "This is not normal. I'll take responsibility. Let it stay." The guard hesitated but eventually sighed and stepped back. The woman stood up, gently stroking Kem's warm fur. "My name is Min. I'll take care of the baby. You can trust me." As if understanding her words, Kem whimpered softly but did not move away. It lay down right outside the emergency room, head resting on its front paws, eyes fixed on the door. Min glanced at the little dog, then turned and entered the emergency room. Professional instincts took over, pushing all other thoughts aside. Inside, the atmosphere was tenser than ever. A team of doctors and nurses worked swiftly, their eyes filled with worry at the baby's condition. Severe hypothermia, slow heart rate, signs of dehydration. Min stood nearby, hands clenched tightly. She had witnessed many emergency cases, but none had ever made her this anxious. A newborn abandoned in the freezing cold? Had it not been discovered in time, it surely wouldn't have survived. Her gaze shifted to the intricately embroidered blanket wrapped around the baby. A beautiful blanket, but something felt off, as if the baby had been placed there intentionally. Why such a fine blanket? If someone could afford it, they surely weren't poor. But if so, why abandon the baby? Swallowing hard, Min forced herself to push those questions aside, focusing on the task at hand. She placed her hand on the baby's tiny fingers, feeling warmth slowly returning. There was hope, but this was far from over. Outside the emergency room, Kem waited patiently. It didn't understand what was happening, but it knew the baby was still in there and it couldn't leave yet. Passers-by stared at the small dog with curiosity. A few nurses whispered to each other, while some older doctors frowned. A stray dog had brought a baby to the hospital. It sounded like something out of a movie, but without it, the baby might not have survived. Someone reached out to pet Chem, but it paid no attention. Its eyes were fixed on the tightly closed door. About an hour later, the door swung open. Min stepped out, looking somewhat tired, but her eyes were less tense than before. Instantly, Chem lifted its head, eyes glimmering with a silent question. "How's the baby?" Min smiled softly. "It's all right. The baby is safe now." Chem trembled slightly, as if it had just shed an invisible burden. But Min knew this was far from over. She glanced down at the little dog, then towards the hallway where the baby was being cared for. The only question echoing in her mind was, who is this baby, and who left it there? Min stood still in front of the emergency room, her breathing uneven after everything that had happened. She looked down into Chem's amber eyes. It stared back as if trying to understand what she was saying. "It's all right," she repeated, bending down to gently stroke Chem's head. "But this isn't over yet." Chem licked her hand softly, then turned its head back towards the emergency room, unwilling to leave. Min sighed, straightened up, and pushed the door open to step inside. Inside the intensive care unit, the newborn lay in a small incubator. Its skin was no longer bluish, its tiny hands less clenched, and its once weak breaths were now steadier, but still fragile, like a small flame in a strong wind. Min walked over slowly, her eyes resting on the tiny face. Who could abandon a child like this, she wondered. Her gaze shifted to the intricately embroidered blanket neatly placed on the table. The overhead light cast a glow, highlighting each delicate stitch on the fabric. Instinct told her that this blanket was the most important clue. Min carefully picked it up. It was no ordinary blanket, nor did it resemble anything sold at markets or shops. It was handmade, each stitch meticulously embroidered, the patterns more complex and refined than anything she had ever seen. There was something truly special about it. Leaving the intensive care unit with the blanket in hand, Min quickly made her way to the nurse's station. There, an older woman was recording notes in a medical log. "Sister Lone," Min called out, her voice more urgent than usual. "I need your help with something." Sister Lone looked up, her gentle eyes showing a hint of surprise. "What is it, Min?" Min held the blanket out in front of her. "Have you seen this blanket before?" Sister Lone frowned, taking the blanket and turning it over carefully. After a moment, her eyes changed subtly. "Really? I've seen this embroidery style before." Min's body tensed, her heart pounding harder. "Where was that, sister?" "A craft village in the Red River Delta." Sister Lone spoke slowly. "The artisans there don't just embroider patterns, they weave the stories of their families into every stitch. This blanket isn't just a beautiful piece of fabric, it holds meaning." A slight shiver ran down Min's spine. She looked again at the blanket in her hands and, for the first time, realized that the patterns weren't random. They were telling a story. Just then, another nurse rushed over, her voice urgent. "Dr. Min, someone wants to see you." Min frowned. "Who is it?" "An old woman. She said she knows about the blanket." Min's heart tightened. She quickly followed the nurse to the waiting area at the front of the hospital. There, an elderly woman with sharp eyes was sitting on a bench. She wore an old brown sweater, her hands resting on a wooden cane. When she saw Min, she nodded slightly. "You're the doctor who took in the baby, aren't you?" Min took a deep breath, sitting down across from her. "Yes, I am." The old woman gazed at her for a moment before slowly pointing to the blanket in Min's hands. "Young lady, do you know what this blanket means?" Min shook her head. "I only know it's not an ordinary blanket. Can you tell me more?" The old woman smiled faintly, but her eyes glimmered with deep sorrow. This blanket belonged to a mother. Min held her breath. A mother who spent countless nights embroidering her story onto it before fate tore her away from her child? Min's throat went dry. Who was that mother? The old woman looked straight into Min's eyes. "She was my granddaughter." Outside the hospital, Chem still lay quietly at the door, but its ears perked up, sensing that something was changing. Its journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Min's heart skipped a beat. She looked at the woman before her, questions racing through her mind. "Your granddaughter?" Her voice trembled slightly. The old woman nodded slowly, her eyes glimmering with the worn light of someone who had seen too much of life. "Yes, her name was Nyok. She's the one who embroidered this blanket." Min's grip tightened on the edge of the blanket, an odd feeling rising within her. Nok. She repeated the name in her mind, trying to attach it to a face, a story, but nothing came. "Can you tell me what happened?" Min asked, her voice softening. The old woman sighed softly, her thin hands gently caressing the cane, as if piecing together fragments of memory. "Nok was a very talented embroiderer," she began. "She was born and raised in a traditional embroidery village. Everyone there knew about her skillful hands. But fate was cruel." The old woman paused, her gaze distant. Min held her breath, waiting. She loved the wrong person. Those words sent a chill down Min's spine. "Loved the wrong person?" she repeated. The old woman nodded. "A man from the city. She loved him, trusted him. But when she was pregnant, he abandoned her without a word of explanation." Min felt her chest tighten. The story was all too familiar. His family did not accept Ngok. What? Not just rejection? Min asked, her voice catching. The old woman chuckled bitterly. Not just rejection. They threatened her. They used money and power to force her to disappear from his life. They said if she didn't give up the baby, they would leave her with no way out. Min clenched her fists. She could almost picture it. A young girl standing at a crossroads, torn between love and survival, between hope and despair. So she ran away? Min asked softly. The old woman nodded. She left the village when her belly started to show. She went to Hanoi, living in hiding, not daring to ask anyone for help, not daring to return. The only thing she could cling to was her embroidery. Min looked down at the blanket in her hands. Each stitch suddenly felt more painful than ever. She embroidered this blanket to tell her story? The old woman nodded slowly, her eyes filled with sorrow. She spent months embroidering while she waited. Every stitch was a tear. She hoped that one day, if she had to part with her child, the baby could still find its way back to its roots. Min bit her lip, her heart aching. The blanket wasn't just a blanket. It was a message, a fragment of a mother's soul who had been cornered by fate. But what happened then? She asked gently, though she already had a vague sense of the answer. The old woman closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again, her voice heavy. Nok was ill. Min blinked, a wave of unease rising in her chest. Ill was she? The old woman nodded faintly. After giving birth, her health deteriorated. No money, no one by her side, she tried to hold on. But one day, she realized she couldn't go on. So that's why she... Left the baby? Min whispered, her voice trembling. She had no other choice, the old woman said, her voice breaking. She didn't want her child to witness her dying slowly in pain. She thought that if she left the baby somewhere where people passed by, maybe a kind soul would take it in, would give it a chance to live. Not abandonment, but a chance at life. Min felt a chill spread through her body. She recalled the scene that morning. The baby curled up among old fabrics, a stray dog pulling it from the shadows amidst the cold of winter. And Gog had bet her child's fate on the kindness of the world. And perhaps she was right. Min took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. Do you know where Gok is now? The old woman looked down at the floor, her hands gripping the cane tightly. A friend in the village told me that Ngok has returned, but she's not well. She's looking for her child. Min's heart pounded fiercely. Ngok was looking for her child, and that very child was lying in the intensive care unit of this hospital. Something like an electric current shot through Min. She couldn't just ignore this. She had to find Ngok. Min sprang to her feet, her eyes sharper than ever. Can you take me to her? She asked. The old woman stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. Yes, but we have to be careful. Min frowned. Why? The old woman's eyes held something difficult to express. Because not everyone wants Ngok to reunite with her child. Someone is trying to prevent this. Min froze, a chill running down her spine. Outside, Kem also lifted its head, its brown eyes glinting with wariness. It sensed that something was off, and indeed, things were far from over. This was only the beginning. The old woman nodded, her eyes a mix of sorrow and caution. You have no idea what they might do, young lady. That man's family has never let Nyok go. And if they find out the child is still alive, she paused, but Min understood. If they knew the child was alive, if they knew Ngok had returned, they would do anything to silence the truth. Min clenched her fists. An image of the child lying still in the intensive care unit flashed in her mind. No, she couldn't let this happen. She took a deep breath and nodded. We need to leave right away. Outside the hospital, Kem was still lying by the entrance, but its ears perked up, eyes scanning every passerby with vigilance. It sensed that something wasn't right. A sleek black car pulled up near the hospital gate. Two men in black coats stepped out, their eyes sweeping the area with a scrutinizing gaze. Kem let out a low growl from its throat. It didn't like these two men, not because of their scent, but because of the way they looked around, eyes sharp as if searching for something, or someone. At that moment, Min and the old woman stepped out of the door. Min immediately sensed that something was wrong. She paused, casting a glance at the two men. They were watching the hospital, searching for something or someone. Min's fists tightened. She needed to get out of here immediately. The old woman had noticed too. She quickened her pace, her voice low. They're watching us. We have to leave now. But just as Min was about to turn into a nearby alley, one of the men called out, Miss Min? Min's body stiffened. She didn't know who they were, but if they knew her name, it meant they had already investigated her. Min turned around, her gaze steady but her nerves taut. Yes? The taller man stepped forward, a smile on his face that felt anything but sincere. We're a family of the abandoned child from this morning. Min's heart clenched. Family? She frowned. The man nodded, pulling out a business card and extending it to her. We're the child's paternal relatives. We're here to take the child back to the family. A blatant lie. Min was certain they were lying. If they were truly family, they wouldn't have waited until now to show up. They would have come as soon as the child was discovered. No, they were here for another reason. To take the child away. To silence everything. Min clenched the cloth in her hand. Her eyes darkened. She stared straight into the man's eyes, her voice calm but laced with sharp caution. Is that so? In that case, can you provide documents proving a blood relation to the child? The man hesitated for a moment, then smiled. But that smile was no longer friendly. We just want to take the child back. There's no need for you to make this difficult. Min took a deep breath, feeling her heart beat faster. They were trying to pressure her. The old woman gently squeezed Min's hand, her voice soft. Don't say anything more. Let's go. Min nodded, turned, and headed into the nearby alley. At that moment, Kem sprang forward, biting hard into the man's pants leg and yanking back with fierce determination. Damn dog, the man snarled, kicking hard at Kem, but the dog quickly leaped back, buying enough time for Min and the old woman to escape. Get them, the man shouted. Min clung tightly to the old woman's hand, weaving rapidly through narrow alleys. She couldn't let them catch her, couldn't let them find the child. They reached a bus stop just in time for a bus about to leave. Min helped the old woman onto the bus while Kem leaped in right after them. The door shut just as the two men appeared at the end of the street. Min exhaled sharply, her heart still pounding. She looked out the window and saw the two men standing there, eyes cold and fixed on the departing bus. They hadn't given up. They would come back. Min turned forward. She had to find Ook before they did, before it was too late. The old bus rumbled on, leaving behind the bustling streets and the two men with their piercing gazes still watching. Min was still tense, her hands clutching the edge of the seat, heart hammering in her chest. The old woman beside her was still catching her breath after the frantic escape. Meanwhile, Kem curled up under the seat, eyes never leaving the door, as if it knew the danger was far from over. Min took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She turned to the old woman, her voice low. Are you sure Nok is in the village? The old woman nodded slightly, her weary eyes reflecting a deep concern. My friend said she reappeared a few days ago, but she's very weak, too afraid to stay in one place for long. She's hiding from someone. Min swallowed hard. Do you think someone is trying to catch her? The old woman fell silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. Not just trying to catch her, but to stop her. Min felt a chill run through her entire body at the thought of the two men earlier. They didn't come to the hospital out of concern for the child. They came for another reason, to bury this story. If they knew Angok was still alive, that thought made Min tense. She needed to find Angok before they did. The bus swayed as it traveled over the bumpy roads, moving further away from the city and into the countryside. Through the window, endless rice fields stretched out, red tiled roofs peeked behind bamboo groves, and traditional embroidery villages appeared peaceful and quiet. But this peace could very well be just a facade. Min could feel the oppressive atmosphere hanging over the place. When they got off the bus, the old woman gripped Min's hand tightly, whispering, "We have to be careful." Min nodded slightly, glancing down at Kem. The small dog, alert and looking around, its tail twitching lightly as if it could sense the danger too. They walked through narrow, gravel-covered paths deeper into the village. There was something off about the air here. The villagers stared at them, some whispering to each other, others avoiding Min's gaze. They were afraid of something. Min lowered her voice, asking the old woman, "Are you sure your friend was right? Is Angok really here?" The old woman nodded, but her voice was heavy with worry. If she hasn't left, then she's hiding. Min's throat felt dry. She quickened her pace, approaching a small house tucked deep within the village, its brick walls aged and wooden door faded. The old woman knocked 3 times. No one answered. Min frowned, raising her voice. "I'm Dr. Min. I'm here to help you." A long silence followed, making Min almost believe that no one was inside. But then a faint sound emerged, the scraping of a chair, slow footsteps, and the wooden door creaked open. A woman stood behind the door, frail with pale skin and sunken eyes from lack of sleep. Yet in those eyes there was still a glimmer of light, however weak. Min recognized her immediately. It was Ngok. Ngok looked at Min, then at the old woman, her eyes suddenly wary. She took a step back, her voice weak but firm. "Who are you?" Min placed a hand on her chest, trying to reassure the girl before her. "We're here to help you. We know about you and your daughter." Immediately, Ngok's expression shifted. My daughter, she's alive?" Her voice trembled. Min nodded, her tone gentle but certain. "She's at the hospital." She was saved. A dog found her and brought her to the hospital just in time. Nipchunk froze. A dog? She looked down, and for the first time her eyes met Kem's, the small cream-colored dog staring right at her, its brown eyes unwaveringly sad. And Chunk burst into tears. Endo couldn't believe it. Her child was alive, saved. But just as her tears began to fall, a sound from outside made all 3 of them freeze. The screech of a car stopping abruptly. The slam of car doors turned the atmosphere suffocating. The old woman immediately gripped Min's hand tightly, her eyes filled with panic. Min felt her heart tighten. They had found them. From outside, a cold male voice called out, "Nok, we know you're in there. Come out, now." Nok shivered. her lips turning pale. Min turned to the old woman, her voice very low but firm. "We can't let them take her." Ngok looked at Min, fear glimmering in her eyes, but also a spark of determination. Min clenched her fists, refusing to let that family take away the only chance for Min and her daughter. Kem let out a low growl, ears perked up. Outside, footsteps grew closer. The final confrontation had arrived. Pale sunlight of the late afternoon filtered through the cracks in the door, casting shadows of tall figures advancing steadily. Ngok trembled, stepping back, her hand gripping the edge of the door as if it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Min's heart pounded fiercely, but she did not back down. The old woman whispered, "We must find a way to get Ngok out of here." Min nodded, knowing she was racing against time. If they broke in, they could drag Ngok away, threaten her, do anything to bury this story. She couldn't let that happen. The pounding on the door was forceful. "Nijok, we know you're in there. Don't make us force you." Nijok trembled, but this time she did not bow her head. She had been running long enough. Min took a deep breath, turning to the old woman and Ngok. "I'll buy you time. You two find a way out through the back door." Ngok's eyes widened, about to protest, but Min raised a hand to stop her. "Trust me, I won't let them hurt you. But you must live, must see your daughter again." A moment of silence hung in the air before Ngok nodded slightly, tears streaming down her face. The old woman took Ngok's hand, pulling her toward the back door. Min turned and strode quickly to the front door. She took a deep breath, then boldly pulled it open. Two men stood towering before the porch, their faces cold. Min met their gaze without hesitation. "What do you want?" Her voice was steady and unyielding. The taller man stepped forward, eyes sharp. "We're here to take Ngok." Min crossed her arms, eyes unblinking. "On what grounds?" He sneered. "On the grounds that she's caused enough trouble already." Rage flared within Min, but she kept her composure. "She is not a criminal. If you want to talk, she has the right to defend herself." The shorter man smirked. "You don't understand, Dr. Min. You're meddling in something that doesn't concern you." Min smiled coldly. "Oh, but I think it does. Because I'm the one who saved her daughter, and I won't let you tear them apart now." The two men froze, clearly not expecting Min to be so resolute. At that moment, Min suddenly dashed out from the house, barking fiercely. The men flinched, stepping back, eyes locked on the small dog. Kim's fur stood on end, brown eyes gleaming with absolute vigilance. It was no longer an innocent stray. It was a protector now. The taller man took a step back, his confidence faltering. "What a nuisance," he muttered. Min realized they didn't dare cause a scene right here. This was her chance. She lowered her voice, but her words were sharp. "Listen closely. If you try to harm Ngok or her daughter again, I will call the police. Then we'll see who's really causing trouble." The two men exchanged glances, hesitation evident. As if accepting that today was not their day, the taller one jerked his head, signaling a retreat. They turned swiftly, striding back to their car. The black sedan sped off, leaving a cloud of dust and a tense silence behind. Min exhaled, her breath shaky from the tension. She turned back to the old woman and Ngok, both still standing behind the door, eyes wide with fear. Yet, amidst that fear, there was resilience. 2 days later, Ngok embraced her daughter for the first time in months. In the small hospital room, a warm afternoon light filtered through. A mother wept silently. A child squirmed in her arms, and a small dog lay at their feet, eyes half closed but ears perked in alertness. Minhin stood by, emotion swelling within her. She once thought she was just a doctor, but this moment made her realize that sometimes saving a life means saving fates, stories, and pieces once thought irreparable. The old woman gently placed a hand on Min's shoulder, her voice warm and soft. "You did a very good thing, young lady." Min smiled, reaching down to stroke Kem's head. "It wasn't just me. Kem was the real hero." Kem licked her hand softly, brown eyes shining with absolute trust. Ngok bent down, holding her daughter close. "I'll never leave you again, Mai." The little girl looked up at her mother as if she understood that promise. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the city in a gentle shade of gold. But for those in that small room, a new day was truly beginning. Dear audience, thank you for your time and attention to today's story. The journey of these characters was not just about fighting for survival, but also a testament to compassion, perseverance, and unconditional love. The lessons to be learned lie not only in the challenges they faced, but also in how they confronted adversity, overcame fear, and protected what mattered most. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Your support is the greatest motivation for us to continue bringing you more meaningful stories. Sincere thanks, and may you always find peace and happiness.